There is a place in central Greece where the mountains crack open and the sky falls into the valley like a held breath. Delphi sits on the southwestern slope of Mount Parnassus, roughly 1,800 feet above the Gulf of Corinth, perched on a series of limestone terraces that look out over an ocean of olive trees, silver green and ancient, stretching all the way to the sea. The landscape is violent and beautiful. Two enormous cliffs, the Phaedriades, the shining ones, rise behind the sanctuary like the jaws of some geological mouth, their pale limestone faces catching the sun and throwing it back across the valley in slabs of gold and white. Between these two cliffs, a narrow gorge splits the rock, and from this gorge falls the Castalian spring, sacred water that has been flowing since before anyone thought to give it a name. Below the sanctuary, the Pleistos Valley drops away steeply, carpeted with what is said to be the largest olive grove in Greece, hundreds of thousands of trees, their canopy undulating in the wind like something breathing. The place has an unmistakable quality of threshold, of being between things, between mountain and sea, between sky and earth, between the human world and whatever lies beneath it. For over 1,000 years, from roughly the 8th century before the Common Era to the 4th century after it, this mountainside was the most sacred site in the Western world. Kings, generals, and entire city-states travelled here to ask a single woman a question and to sit with whatever answer she gave them. Her name was not her own. She was called the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, and she spoke with the voice of a god while sitting on a bronze tripod above a crack in the earth's crust. The oracle at Delphi shaped the course of wars, the founding of cities, and the birth of philosophy. It was consulted before nearly every major decision in the ancient Greek world, and at its center was something that no modern institution has ever attempted, a civilization that trusted altered consciousness, a woman in a trance, breathing gases from a geological fault line, over rational analysis, not occasionally, not as a curiosity, as policy, for 1,000 years. Tonight, we are going to walk the sacred way at Delphi, the same path that Croesus walked before he lost his empire, that the Athenians walked before Salamis saved Greece, that Socrates' friend walked before asking the question that launched Western philosophy. We are going to descend into the Adyton, the innermost chamber, and sit with the Pythia in the dark, and we are going to ask the question that the ancient world spent 1,000 years asking. What happens when you stop talking and start listening? But first, the geology, because what makes Delphi unlike any other ancient sanctuary is what lies beneath it. The Temple of Apollo sits directly above the intersection of two major geological fault lines, the Delphi Fault, running east to west, and the Kerner Fault, running north to south. These faults are not dormant. They are extensional fissures in actively shifting limestone, and their intersection creates a zone of fractured rock through which gases from deep within the earth can rise to the surface. The ancient Greeks did not have the language of geology, but they understood what was happening in their own way. They said the earth breathed here. They were not wrong. The surrounding limestone is bituminous, containing roughly 20% petrochemical content. Friction along the fault lines heats this limestone, vaporizing the hydrocarbons and allowing them to rise through the fractured rock and dissolve into groundwater. For most of the 20th century, scholars dismissed the ancient accounts of vapors as myth. A series of French excavations in the 1890s found no chasm, no fissure, no volcanic activity. The British scholar A.P. Oppé declared in 1904 that there was no chasm, no mephitic vapour, no fumes of any kind. Then, in the mid-1990s, a geologist named Gel de Boer noticed something the French archaeologists had missed. The limestone beneath the temple showed clear evidence of fault-line activity. His subsequent collaboration with archaeologist John Hale produced a landmark study published in the journal Geology in 2001. They identified ethylene gas, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon, seeping from the fault intersection directly beneath the temple. Ethylene was used as a clinical anesthetic from the 1920s through the 1960s. At low concentrations, it produces a state of mild euphoria, disembodied floating sensations, and altered speech. At moderate concentrations, it induces pronounced trance states. At high concentrations, it produces violent reactions, thrashing, screaming, loss of motor control, and can be fatal. And Plutarch, who served as a priest of Apollo at Delphi and witnessed the oracle firsthand, specifically recorded that the pneuma in the additon had a sweet, perfume-like fragrance. The most sacred institution in the ancient world was built on a chemical reaction between geology and the human nervous system. The Earth was genuinely doing something, and the Greeks built a civilization on top of it. But the Earth was doing something long before Apollo arrived. The Greeks told a story about how Delphi became the center of the world. Zeus, wanting to find the exact midpoint of the Earth, released two eagles from opposite ends of creation. They flew toward each other across the sky and met here, at this fractured, gas-breathing mountainside. Zeus marked the spot with a stone, and that stone became the most sacred object in the Greek world, the Omphalos, literally the navel of everything. A version of the Omphalos survives today in the Delphi Archaeological Museum. It is smooth, white, shaped like a beehive, and covered with a carved net of fillets called an agranon. It looks less like something carved than something grown. Pausanias, visiting in the 2nd century of the Common Era, reported that it was anointed daily with oil and covered with unworked wool on special occasions. It was the physical marker of cosmic centrality, the point where heaven, earth, and the underworld were said to intersect. But the naval story is the polished version. The older stories are stranger. According to Aeschylus, writing in the Eumenides in 458 BCE, the oracle at Delphi originally belonged not to Apollo but to Gaia, Mother Earth herself. It then passed to her daughter Themis, then to the Titaness Phoebe, and only finally to Apollo, who received it as a gift. This orderly succession is almost certainly a later rationalization, a polite version of something more violent, because other sources tell a different story entirely. In the Homeric hymn to Apollo, composed around 522 BCE, the young god arrives at the site and finds it guarded by a monstrous she-dragon, a creature of Gaia, set there to protect the sacred spring and its prophetic powers. In this earliest account, the serpent is female and nameless. Only later sources call it Python and make it male. Apollo slays the creature with his silver bow, and its body rots in the sun. The Greek word pythian means to rot, and from this the site took its earlier name, Pytho. The Pythia herself took her title from the same root. The most powerful woman in the ancient world was named after a decomposing serpent. The myth is usually read as a straightforward conquest, the new god of light and reason displacing the old chthonic earth religion. But the story is more complicated than that. Apollo does not simply destroy the old order. He incorporates it. He keeps the oracle. He keeps the site. he keeps the prophetic tradition that was already there. The Pythia continues to prophesy from the same spot where Gaia's power was said to emerge from the earth. Apollo puts a new mask on an old face, and the old face keeps speaking. Archaeological evidence supports this reading. Excavations at Delphi have uncovered Mycenaean artifacts dating to the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1400 to 1100 BCE, including female figurines associated with Earth goddess worship. The historian Michael Scott notes that the archaeological record suggests the site was considered sacred for at least 8 centuries before the classical oracle emerged. There are traces of what appears to have been an earlier sacred precinct beneath the foundations of the classical temple. There may also have been an earlier association with Poseidon. Aeschylus mentions the Earthshaker in connection with Delphi's prehistory, both gods of the deep, the subterranean, the forces beneath the human world. When Apollo arrived, he was not founding something new. He was inheriting something ancient and powerful and strange, something that had been happening at this fractured intersection of fault lines for a very long time. He did not silence it. He gave it a temple. Now, imagine you are her. You are not young anymore. You are past 50, selected not for beauty or birth, but for moral character, for a life lived without scandal. You are from a local family in Delphi, perhaps not even literate. Until you were chosen, you were no one of consequence. Now, you are the most powerful woman in the Mediterranean. But you do not speak in your own name. You never will. The Pythia was not a single woman, but a succession of women, each selected by the priests of Apollo to serve as his voice. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi for roughly 30 years and witnessed the oracle firsthand, reports that the Pythia was chosen from among local women, typically from a respectable family, but not necessarily a prominent one. What mattered were personal qualities: purity, uprightness, a life without scandal. Originally, she was a young virgin, a maiden consecrated to the god. But this changed. Diodorus Siculus records that a man named Echecrates of Thessaly, having come to consult the oracle, became enamored of her because of her beauty, carried her away and violated her. After this, the Delphians passed a law. The Pythia should henceforth be a woman over 50, past childbearing years and, in the thinking of the time, beyond the reach of sexual temptation. But as a reminder of the prophetess of old, the older woman still dressed in the garments of a maiden, there is something haunting about this. An elderly woman dressed as a girl, sitting in the dark, speaking with the voice of a god. At the height of the oracle's popularity, roughly the 6th through 4th centuries BCE, demand was so great that up to 3 Pythia served simultaneously, with 2 on active duty and 1 in reserve. The oracle operated on the 7th day of each month, the day sacred to Apollo during 9 months of the year. During the 3 winter months, Apollo was believed to depart for the land of the Hyperboreans, and Dionysus took his place on the mountain. No prophecies were given in winter. Even the god of light needed darkness to rest. The preparation rituals were elaborate. On the morning of a consultation day, the Pythia would fast, then bathe in the cold waters of the Castalian spring. She would burn laurel leaves and barley on an altar. A goat was sprinkled with cold water. If it trembled at the splash, a sign that the god was willing to speak, it was sacrificed. If it did not tremble, the consultation was cancelled. The divine could not be forced. When the signs were favourable, the Pythia descended into the Adyton, the innermost chamber of the temple below the main floor, accessible only to her. Ancient sources agree on the key details. It was small, partially underground, and contained the Omphalos stone, a golden statue of Apollo, laurel branches, and the tripod, the three-legged bronze seat upon which she sat. The tripod was not merely furniture, it was a throne between worlds, elevated above the floor and positioned directly above the crevice in the rock, the chasma through which the pneuma rose. She would sit on the tripod, hold branches of laurel, chew laurel leaves, and breathe. What happened next is described differently by different sources, and the variation itself is telling. Some accounts describe a calm, focused trance with coherent speech. Others describe wild, ecstatic possession, thrashing, screaming, speaking in tongues. Plutarch seems to describe a range of states. In one vivid account, he records a session where the Pythia was forced to prophesy against the omens. The sacrificial goat had not trembled, but the priests, pressured by impatient consultants, doused it with cold water until it shook. From the outset, Plutarch writes, it was clear from the harshness of her voice that she was not responding properly. She was like a laboring ship, filled with a mighty and baleful spirit. Finally, she rushed screaming toward the door and fell to the ground, whereupon all those present, and even the priests, fled in terror. When they came back to pick her up, they found her senses restored, but she died within a few days. Something was genuinely happening to her, something that could, under the wrong conditions, kill. Under normal circumstances, the Pythia's utterances were relayed to the waiting consultants by the prophetai, male priests who served as intermediaries. The exact nature of their role is debated. Some scholars argue that the priests composed the oracular responses themselves, using the Pythia's incoherent utterances as raw material. Others argue that she spoke more coherently than later sources suggest, and that the priest's role was primarily transmission rather than interpretation. In the Archaic period, responses frequently came in hexameter verse, the meter of epic poetry. By the Classical period, prose had become more common. She served for life. She was required to remain chaste and to live apart from ordinary society, dedicated entirely to her role as the god's instrument. In a culture where women had virtually no public authority, the Pythia occupied a paradox, the most powerful woman in the ancient world, shaping the fate of empires, yet speaking always in another's name. She was, in the language of anthropology, a liminal figure, neither fully present in the human world nor fully absent from it, permanently on the threshold. The voice that moved nations was hers. The authority was not. Around 560 BCE, the wealthiest man in the world decided to test the gods. Croesus, king of Lydia, sent envoys to 7 different oracular centers across the ancient world. His instructions were precise. On the 100th day after their departure, each oracle was to be asked what the king of Lydia was doing at that exact moment. Croesus had deliberately chosen an action so bizarre that no human intelligence could predict it. He was boiling a tortoise and a lamb together in a bronze cauldron covered with a bronze lid. 6 oracles failed. The Pythia at Delphi answered, "I can count the grains of sand and measure the sea. I understand the dumb and hear the speechless. A smell comes to my senses of a mightily armored tortoise being boiled in bronze together with lamb meat, with bronze below and bronze above." Croesus was stunned. He lavished the temple with gifts of astonishing extravagance. 117 ingots of gold, a golden lion weighing 10 talents, bowls of gold and silver, his wife's necklaces. Then he asked the question that actually mattered. Should he go to war against Cyrus the Great of Persia? The oracle's response has echoed through 2,500 years. If Croesus crosses the Halys River, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus took this as confirmation. He crossed the Halys. A great empire was indeed destroyed, his own. Lydia fell to Persia in 546 BCE, when Croesus, now a prisoner, sent envoys to Delphi to reproach the god. The oracle replied that the prophecy had been perfectly accurate. A great empire had been destroyed. Croesus had simply assumed it would be someone else's. A century later, the stakes were civilizational. In 480 BCE, with Xerxes' massive Persian army bearing down on Greece, Athens sent envoys to Delphi in desperation. The first response was apocalyptic, essentially flee to the ends of the earth. All is lost. Horrified, the Athenians begged for a second hearing. The Pythia relented. Though all else shall be taken, yet Zeus the all-seeing grants to Athene's prayer that the wooden wall only shall not fall, but help you and your children. Holy Salamis, you shall destroy the offspring of women when men scatter the seed or when they gather the harvest. The debate that followed was itself history-altering. Some elders argued that the wooden walls meant the ancient wooden palisade around the Acropolis, that the Athenians should barricade themselves there and wait. Themistocles argued that the wooden walls meant the hulls of Athens' fleet of triremes, and the reference to Holy Salamis rather than Cruel Salamis or Accursed Salamis indicated that those who died there would be Greece's enemies, not the Athenians themselves. Themistocles prevailed. Athens was evacuated. The Persian army sacked the empty city and burned the Acropolis. And then, in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the mainland, the Greek fleet crushed the Persian navy in one of the most decisive battles in human history. The course of Western civilization turned on the interpretation of an ambiguous prophecy. Then there is Socrates. In Plato's Apology, Socrates reports that his friend Chaerephon once went to Delphi and asked the oracle whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. The Pythia answered that no one was. Socrates, who claimed to know nothing, was baffled. He set out to disprove the oracle by questioning every supposedly wise man in Athens: politicians, poets, craftsmen. Each time he found that these men believed they knew things they did not actually know. Socrates concluded that the oracle was correct in a paradoxical way. He was the wisest because he alone recognized the extent of his own ignorance. "I am wiser than this man," Socrates said, "for neither of us really knows anything fine and good. But this man thinks he knows something when he does not, whereas I, as I do not know anything, do not think I do either." The Socratic method, the relentless questioning of assumptions, the insistence that wisdom begins with the admission of ignorance, was born from a consultation with the oracle at Delphi, and inscribed above the entrance to Apollo's temple were the two words that Socrates took as his life's mission: gnothi sioton, know thyself. And then there is Alexander. In 336 BCE, the young conqueror arrived at Delphi seeking a prophecy about his planned invasion of Persia. He had the misfortune of arriving on an inauspicious day. The Pythia refused to see him. Alexander did not accept refusal. According to Plutarch, he went up himself and tried to drag her to the temple, whereupon, as if overcome by his ardor, she said, "Thou art invincible, my son." On hearing this, Alexander declared that he wanted no other prophecy. He took her involuntary exclamation, what may have been pain rather than prophecy, as divine confirmation. It tells you something about how oracles actually functioned. The meaning was always, to some degree, in the hands of the listener. There is one more role the oracle played that rarely makes the dramatic retellings, but it may have been the most consequential of all. During the Great Age of Greek expansion, from the 8th through 6th centuries BCE, it became standard practice to consult Delphi before founding a new colony. The oracle would approve or disapprove the venture, designate the location, sometimes even name the leader: Syracuse, Massalia, modern Marseille, Byzantium, which would become Constantinople, which would become Istanbul. Through this process, the oracle at Delphi functioned as something like a central planning authority for the expansion of Greek civilization across the Mediterranean. Every prophecy was different, but every prophecy worked the same way. The oracle gave you something to interpret, and your interpretation revealed who you already were. Know thyself. 2 words carved above the entrance to the most powerful institution in the ancient world. Not know the future, not know the gods, know yourself. And beside it, a second inscription: nothing in excess, med and agon. These are usually read as philosophical propositions, nice thoughts for a bumper sticker, but in context, they were something far more practical. They were instructions for how to receive a prophecy. Consider the structure of a typical consultation. A petitioner traveled for days or weeks to reach Delphi. He fasted, bathed in sacred water, sacrificed an animal, paid consultation fees, and waited, sometimes for months, for his turn. By the time he stood before the prophetai and heard the pythia's words, he had invested enormous time, money, and emotional energy. He was primed for meaning. Then he received a response that was not a direct answer, but an image, a metaphor, a riddle. Wooden walls. A great empire will be destroyed. No man is wiser. These are not instructions. They are mirrors. They force the questioner to interpret, to project, to decide for himself what the words mean, and, in doing so, to reveal his own assumptions, fears, and desires. The oracle did not tell you the truth. It told you something that forced you to discover it. The modern parallel is striking. Open-ended questions are the foundation of psychotherapy, of counseling, of Socratic pedagogy. A good therapist does not tell you what to do. She asks questions that force you to discover what you already believe. The oracle at Delphi was performing a similar function on a civilizational scale. The ambiguity was not a failure of communication, it was the mechanism. Now go back to the inscriptions. Know thyself, because the oracle's words will reflect what you bring to them. Nothing in excess, because the temptation, when facing the divine, is to overinterpret, to see what you want to see, to mistake your own ambition for the voice of the god. Croesus failed both tests. He did not know himself, did not see that his certainty of victory was a projection of his own desire, and he interpreted in excess, heard only the half of the prophecy that confirmed what he already wanted to do. Socrates passed both tests. He knew himself well enough to be genuinely puzzled by the oracle's claim, and he interpreted with restraint, not leaping to a flattering conclusion but methodically testing the prophecy against reality until he understood what it actually meant. The oracle provided not information but authorization. It gave permission to act, and it located that permission in something larger than the self. You were no longer acting entirely on your own judgment. You were acting within a framework of meaning that connected your individual decision to the will of the gods, to the fate of your city, to the order of the cosmos. This is what the modern world has lost. Not the ability to make decisions. We have more information than any civilization in history, but the ability to locate those decisions in a framework of meaning that feels genuinely authoritative. We have data. We lack sanction. We have options. We lack orientation. The ancients did not go to Delphi for information. They went for permission to trust what they already knew, but could not on their own authority bring themselves to act upon. It would be a mistake to imagine Delphi as a quiet monastery. It was, at its peak, one of the most politically charged places on Earth. Think of it this way. Every major city-state and kingdom in the Greek world and beyond it sent delegations to Delphi. Envoys from Lydia, Persia, Egypt, Rome. Each delegation brought gifts, conducted conversations with the priests, and inevitably disclosed political intelligence, military plans, economic conditions, internal disputes, factional conflicts. The priests of Apollo sat at the center of a vast information network. They did not need supernatural powers to be well informed. They just needed to listen, which at Delphi was the one thing everyone was doing. The key political institution was the Amphictyonic League, a religious association of 12 Greek tribal groups that jointly administered the sanctuary and its festivals, including the Pythian Games. The League met twice a year, and its members swore oaths not to destroy each other's cities and to punish anyone who violated the sanctuary. In theory, it was a religious body dedicated to sacred neutrality. In practice, it was one of the primary vehicles through which Greek city-states competed for power. The League could levy fines, impose sanctions, and, most consequentially, declare sacred wars against those who violated the sanctuary. There were 4 sacred wars, and they increasingly served as pretext for military adventurism by powerful states. The Third Sacred War, from 356 to 346 BCE, was the most devastating. The Phocians, facing a crippling fine imposed by the League at Thebes' instigation, seized the sanctuary and used its vast treasury, accumulated over centuries of offerings, to hire mercenary armies. The war lasted a decade, drew in most of the major Greek powers, and was ultimately ended by Philip II of Macedon, who used his role as defender of the sanctuary to legitimize Macedonian control over central Greece. The oracle itself was not above the fray. Herodotus records that the Spartan king Cleomenes bribed the Pythia to declare his co-king Demaratus illegitimate. The bribery was later exposed, and the Pythia, a woman named Perialis, was deposed. The Athenian Alcmaeonid family, who funded the temple's rebuilding after the fire of 548 BCE, were accused of bribing the Pythia to tell every Spartan visitor to free Athens from its tyrants, which Sparta eventually did. But this does not make the oracle a fraud. It makes it a complex institution operating simultaneously on multiple levels: religious, psychological, political, and informational. The priests may well have believed in the divine inspiration of the Pythia, while also recognizing that careful intelligence gathering made for better prophecies. A god who knows everything would, after all, be well informed about political realities. Hugh Bowden argues that the vast majority of documented consultations concerned religious matters, the proper performance of rituals, the founding of cults, the interpretation of omens. The dramatic political oracles were the exception, preserved precisely because they made for compelling stories. Delphi was not the intelligence agency of the ancient world, but it was a place where spiritual authority and political power converged in ways that made it indispensable. And that convergence was not a contradiction, it was the point. Here is something that should unsettle any theory that reduces the pythia to a local curiosity, a peculiarly Greek invention, an accident of geology and politics. She was not unique, she was everywhere. Before Delphi rose to prominence, the oldest oracle in Greece was at Dodona, in the remote northwest. Dodona was sacred to Zeus, and its method was radically different. No enclosed temple, no tripod, no gaseous fissure. Instead, a sacred oak tree, the most ancient and holy tree in Greece. The will of Zeus was read through the rustling of its leaves in the wind, the cooing of sacred doves in its branches, and the ringing of bronze cauldrons suspended from the boughs. Homer mentions Dodona in the Iliad, where Achilles prays to Lord Zeus, Dodonaean, Pelasgian, dwelling afar. Archaeologists at Dodona have uncovered thousands of lead question tablets, thin sheets on which petitioners scratch their questions before submitting them. They date from the 6th through 2nd centuries BCE, and they are extraordinarily intimate. Questions about marriage, children, lost property, health, travel. They are the voice of ordinary human anxiety, preserved in metal for 2,000 years. Deep in the Libyan desert at the Siwa oasis stood the oracle of Amun, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. Alexander the Great made his famous pilgrimage there in 332 BCE, leading a small party across hundreds of miles of trackless desert. According to the ancient sources, they ran out of water and were saved by a miraculous rainfall. What Alexander asked the oracle, and what the oracle answered, was one of the great secrets of antiquity. Neither he nor his companions ever publicly disclosed the conversation, but from that day forward, Alexander styled himself the son of Amun Zeus. The coins struck after his death show him with ram's horns curving from his temples. At Siwa, prophecy came not through a human medium, but through the movement of a sacred bark, a boat-shaped vessel carried on the shoulders of priests. The god's answer was read from the direction and manner of its movements, an entirely different method, an identical function. Perhaps the most remarkable parallel is the Nechung oracle of Tibet, because it is still active. The Nechung serves as the official state oracle of the Tibetan government and has been consulted by the Dalai Lama for centuries. The medium is a Buddhist monk who enters a violent trance state in which a protector deity possesses his body. He dresses in elaborate robes and a massive metal headdress weighing over 80 pounds. As the trance deepens, his body convulses, his face changes, and he speaks in a voice that is not his own, high-pitched, hissing, sometimes barely intelligible. Attendants must support his body under the weight. The Nechung oracle was reportedly consulted about whether the Dalai Lama should flee Tibet in 1959. No one familiar with the story of Salamis could fail to recognize the pattern. In Japan, the Shinto Miko, shrine maidens, were originally shamanic figures who entered states of divine possession called kamigakari. The Miko channeled the kami through trance dance, spinning in alternating directions until possession took hold. Her utterances were interpreted by male priests, a structure almost identical to the pythia and the prophetai. In the Vodou traditions of Haiti and West Africa, spirit possession is not marginal but central. The spirits, the LWA, are understood to mount their devotees during ritual. The possessed person is called a chwal, a horse. Each spirit has characteristic behaviors, speech patterns, preferences. The community recognizes which spirit has arrived and interacts accordingly. A dedicated human being, a ritual context, a transpersonal entity speaking through the medium, a community that treats the utterances as authoritative. The mechanism differs. At Delphi it was gas-assisted. In Vodou it is primarily rhythmic, driven by drumming and chanting and dance. But the underlying human capacity being accessed is the same. The anthropologist Mircea Eliade called shamanism the most ancient technique of ecstasy. Whether you understand the experience in supernatural terms or naturalistic ones, the phenomenon is universal. Every human culture ever studied has produced some version of this. A practitioner who enters an altered state, the ordinary self recedes, and something else speaks. The pythia at Delphi was not a Greek oddity. She was the Greek expression of something profoundly and persistently human, something we have not lost the capacity for, only the permission. The oracle at Delphi did not die suddenly. It faded, like a signal growing weaker on a long frequency, still present, still occasionally audible, but increasingly lost in the noise of a changed world. By the time Plutarch served as a priest in the late 1st century of the Common Era, the oracle was a shadow of itself. He devoted an entire dialogue on the obsolescence of oracles to the question of why the oracles of Greece were falling silent. His characters debate multiple explanations: the departure of the daimones who had administered them, the natural depletion of the prophetic pneuma, the moral decline of the age. Where once 3 Pythias had been needed to serve the crowds of petitioners, now 1 was more than sufficient. And she was often idle. Plutarch himself offered what may be the most perceptive diagnosis. He noted that the pneuma in the aditon had been growing weaker over time, that the power of the spirit does not affect the prophetess always and in the same degree. He was describing, without knowing it, the geological reality. As tectonic activity shifted and the fault intersections slowly sealed, the gas emissions that had sustained the oracle for centuries were fading. The earth was still breathing, but more faintly. The Roman period brought both patronage and erosion. When the Emperor Nero visited in 67 CE, his visit was characteristically destructive. He participated in a parody of the Pythian Games, and of course, won every prize. He removed over 500 bronze statues and carried them to Rome. According to one tradition, the oracle warned Nero to beware the 73rd year. Nero, then in his 30s, relaxed. He was overthrown and forced to commit suicide at age 30 by Galba, who was 73 years old. The ambiguity held to the last. The rise of Christianity proved fatal. The early church fathers did not dismiss the oracle as a fraud. That would have been the rational argument. They did something more interesting. They classified it as demonic. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, argued that the Pythia's trance was genuine possession by evil spirits. The Christians believed the oracles were interfaces with real spiritual entities. They simply reclassified those entities as hostile. The most famous document of the oracle's final days is the so-called Last Prophecy, reportedly delivered to envoys of the Emperor Julian, called the Apostate by Christians for his attempt to restore paganism. In 362 CE, Julian sent his physician to consult Delphi. The response, preserved in later sources whose authenticity is debated, was this: "Tell the emperor that my hall has fallen to the ground. Phoebos no longer has his house, nor his mantic bay, nor his prophetic spring. The water has dried up. Whether those words were genuinely spoken by a pythia or attributed later by Christian writers, their emotional force is beyond argument. The god of light and prophecy, who had spoken from this place for 1,000 years, was announcing his own departure. The spring had dried up, the laurel was gone, the house had fallen. In 391 CE, the Emperor Theodosius issued a decree closing all pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire. The sanctuary at Delphi was shuttered, its priests dispersed. A Christian church was built over parts of the site. The Omphalos, the navel of the world, was buried. The Castalian spring continued to flow, but no one washed in it for purification. The fault lines continued to shift, but no one sat above them to listen. Here is the paradox at the heart of everything we have seen tonight. The god inscribed above the door was Apollo, the bright one, god of light, reason, form, clarity, and the activity inside the door was a woman in a trance, speaking in riddles, her consciousness dissolved by gases from a crack in the earth. The Temple of Reason was a house of ecstasy. The god of light presided over an encounter with darkness. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this paradox as the key to Greek civilization itself. In The Birth of Tragedy, he argued that Greek culture was animated by the tension between two fundamental drives: the Apollonian, order, form, individuation, and the Dionysian, dissolution, ecstasy, the merging of the self into something vast and boundless. And these two gods literally shared the same mountain. Apollo ruled Delphi for 9 months. Dionysus ruled it for 3. They were not enemies. They were counterweights. The oracle was the place where these drives were architecturally united. The Doric columns and geometric order of the temple, the inscription "Know Thyself" carved in rational stone, contained at its center a woman in a state beyond reason. Apollo did not suppress the Dionysian. He housed it. He gave it form. He made it safe enough to be useful. When that institution died, Nietzsche would say, "We got half a civilization. The Apollonian without the Dionysian. Reason without ecstasy. We got science, philosophy, technology, law, all the achievements of the rational mind. And we lost the counterbalance, the capacity to surrender the rational mind, to let something else speak, to sit in the dark and listen." Heidegger might frame the loss differently. The pre-Socratic Greeks, he argued, lived in a relationship with being that later Western thought has obscured. They experienced the world not as a collection of objects to be analyzed, but as a presencing, a continuous emergence from hiddenness into disclosure. The oracle was a place where this presencing was ritualized, the hidden made manifest, the concealed revealed, the underground rising to the surface. When the oracles fell silent, we did not merely lose predictions, we lost an attunement, a way of listening that allowed the world to speak. Camus would recognize Delphi as an institution built on the same insight that drives his own work, that the universe does not answer our questions on our terms. The Pythia's riddles were absurd in the precise commusion sense, meaningful but not rational, significant but not transparent. Like Sisyphus with his boulder, the petitioner at Delphi was engaged in a task that could never be fully completed, the task of understanding, and the engagement itself was the point. And Jed McKenna might see something even more unsettling, the institutionalization of not knowing. Know Thyself was not a pleasant invitation to journal about your feelings. It was a challenge. Look at the parts of yourself you have been hiding from. See what you actually believe, as opposed to what you claim to believe. Watch what you do when the oracle tells you something ambiguous, because that is who you are. The earth beneath Delphi is still fractured, the faults still shift, gases still rise through the limestone, though more faintly now than in antiquity. The Castalian spring still flows between the shining cliffs. The olive trees in the valley below still move in the wind like something breathing. No one sits on the tripod anymore. No one breathes the pneuma. No one asks the question, but the earth is still speaking, and the only question that matters, the one the ancients spent 1,000 years sitting with, the one carved in stone above the door of the place where the world came to listen, is not whether we can hear it. It is whether we have forgotten how.